So today we're going to talk a little bit about building relationships. Now, relationships are a fundamental core issue as from us as humans. Our core foundational relationships ultimately start when we are born. It's our relationship with our mother or with our caregiver. And those relationships and those bonds are formed typically through that interaction. Well, we see, of course, in our children and those that we care for that have autism, there are some barriers in creating those relationships. And they're oftentimes defined in the social world through assessments and through other kind of behavioral programming to say, hey, they're just lacking in the ability to have eye contact or have a meaningful conversation or communicate using a traditional method. And all of those are foundational things, core assets, core things that need to happen in order for someone to really develop a meaningful, active, two-way relationship with another person. You know, Tyler really did not have the ability to communicate verbally until he was probably around 6, started forming words. And then a lot of those words really were just replicates of other words that he had heard. He would try to figure out how to use them contextually. Got it wrong the vast majority of times. People would label that as, well, that was an inappropriate word or inappropriate comment, because he would start to string those words together. But a lot of it was just repeating what he heard on maybe a video or a television program or a computer program. But over time, those did develop into sentences. And then around 12 years old, he really started speaking and using those sentences appropriately. As he continued to grow in his understanding, then he was able to really find his words in a way that now allows him to speak in front of literally thousands of people at a time. So now that Tyler has his foundational communication skill set, I'm not going to say perfected by any means, but he has a usable communication skill set. Now he's trying to determine how to use that skill set in order to develop meaningful relationships with other people. Now, this isn't a just natural thing that happens. Tyler really would probably prefer to be alone and just in a room where it's very quiet and maybe dimly lit. That's most comfortable for him. But he also realizes that he has to challenge himself in that area. And it's like you'll hear him say all the time, he's always up for a good challenge. He really is in that period of time in his life where he's starting to want to develop those relationships. Now, does he have an overall passion for that? No. Does he recognize that, yes, it would be good to have friends to do things with? Yes. So it really is more about being part of something, because that was one thing that he's always longed for. And as a father, was probably one of the most difficult things for me to see was the inability for my child to be accepted. And of course, Tyler feeling, and he's talked about this in his other webinars, he just simply wanted to be accepted. He wanted to have relationships with other people. He wanted to be in the context of what he felt was an accepting or part of the group. One of the big reasons why he wrote his book, Population 1, Autism, Adversity, and the Will to Succeed, was an effort to help other kids in his school understand who he was as a person. And he felt that if he could have other people understand who he was, then he would be more readily accepted and then also would be able to develop relationships. You really have to take care of the core sensory issues first. Once you can start dealing with your environment and sensory, then you can start adding additional things like language. And then with language comes relationships, because you have the ability to have an active two-way conversation. And so when you start to understand the individual strengths of that person and the area that they really excel in, then that becomes kind of the first step in building a good relationship with them. So relationships are built on understanding. And then also, once we understand what those individual strengths are, then at that point, we can use those as common points of interest to develop a relationship. And if we can find friends or ourselves, or we can become interested in those same things, we'll find that those are the beginning stages of starting to form those relationship bonds. So really knowing your child well, knowing your adolescent, your teen, your adult, knowing them well and what they struggle with, what some of their challenges are, but then also where they succeed, that will allow us to be able to engage with them in a much more meaningful way. We need to go through testing in order to establish a baseline of exactly where our children are. Now, we may have a gut feel as a parent, but really it's important to have the assessments completed on exactly where your child is from a relationship development perspective. So there's lots of assessments that are available through your school district. Allows them to go through a battery of tests. Those tests are scored. And, oftentimes actually those tests can really increase your confidence and potentially the confidence of the person that you care for in where they are at in their ability to create and have and maintain relationships. The other thing that really works in this is really becoming your child's advocate. Now, that kind of goes without saying. As parents, we really are our children's advocates. Oftentimes, we actually become our children's mouthpieces, and we communicate for them until they have the ability to communicate. We advocate for our child, so we need to make sure that we are in communication and that we're developing the relationships that we need to be developing with our community, with our schools, with the other service providers. And those relationships are very, very important that we maintain. What we really do want to do is we want to be good models in having relationships with other people, especially when when they're present, when we have someone that we're caring for with autism. What would be some of the relationships that we could start creating? Well, we always have our base foundational relationships with our immediate family. So there would be parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, brothers, husbands, wives. Are there ways that you can improve those relationships? And are there ways that you could bring them in to start having some core and building core foundational relationships with the person that you care for that has autism? It's no matter how old or how young they may be, introducing them to different people using a common element, meaning something that they're interested in, allows them to develop, again, these core foundational relationships that serve as models for their other relationship. Exposing them to a larger number of core relationships, whether it be immediate family members, and those typically are always the easiest. You can generate the most interest. You can explain and educate about things and unique abilities and the things that your person that you care for really wants to talk about or wants to just interact with or play with. Those are the beginnings of those foundational relationships. And the more files, the more relationships that you have, then in the future, when that person with autism starts to connect that together, that will form the context of what we would call healthy relationships. And then they may be able to start go out and creating their own individual files. So again, relationships are built on active two-way conversation or two-way communication, whatever form that may be. well, how is it that my child is responding to me? Are they creating that bond? Do they have the ability to communicate either verbally or using other methods? So how are they interacting and how are they communicating? Then the question becomes is how are they communicating and interacting with other people? So maybe that's immediate family members. That would be brothers and sisters or other people that would be in their immediate family or potentially extended family. Then how are they interacting with those that are at school, their peers? What are those interactions like? How are they doing in a structured environment? So you think potentially at home, there will be certain tasks that you can do. Maybe there'll be certain things that you talk about. And one of the examples I give is talking on the phone. So literally for years, if I did not pick up the phone when Tyler called, Tyler would leave a voicemail, and that voicemail was exactly the same for years because that was his file. That was, okay, this is what I do when my dad doesn't pick up the phone. And until he was probably around 16 or 17 years old, the voicemail started to change because he was able to pull different words and start to formulate the different thoughts about the context of leaving a voicemail message. Now, if you're in a structured environment, let's say a social skills group, which is also a great thing to do as well. There are all sorts of social skills groups, either that are inside of the school district or potentially there are groups, meetup groups, groups that are formed by individual counselors or therapists. And so I highly encourage you to, if it's age appropriate and it's appropriate in where your child or young adult or adult's development would be, is to get them involved in a social group or a social program where they can really start learning and developing and practicing these social skills. So that is a structured environment. So it's a structured social skill. Maybe there's certain structured ways that they go about interactions. But then when you take that structure and go practice it and put it out in an unstructured environment, how do they do? How do they do with that? So by asking yourself these questions, you start to get an idea of where they're at relationship and where they're at developmentally from a relationship perspective. And why that's so important is that you really cannot put the cart before the horse. You have to really start on the foundational relationship concepts first, and then ultimately start progressing to advanced concepts. And base concepts are things like just how to interact with another person appropriately. You know, what's expected and what's not expected. They may or may not have the ability to do that. You know, headbutting other people or biting them or those things. That's not appropriate social interaction. That's not a good way to develop a relationship. So it's really replacing those and those behaviors with ones that would be more socially appropriate that allows them to build those relationships. So how do you do that? Well, a lot of it is social stories modeling. It's just, here are the social stories. You know, here is the expected, here's the unexpected, oftentimes doing that with pictures, maybe doing that with colors. So you replace the socially inappropriate with the appropriate behavior. So really, all of this is just one big data collection exercise, and it's just trying multiple things that end up working so that you can just make ever so slightly more progress each day. And then before you know it, throughout the weeks and months and years, they will become successful in developing some of those base informations. Now, this may be completely overwhelming. And I get that. I get that as a parent. Such desperate feelings and desperate times. And even now, you know, Tyler's 23 years old, and he still struggles with developing relationships with other people and maintaining those relationships. If you look at where his peer group is at just a different area emotionally, the things that they like to do, the spontaneity at which they do them. Again, it's just a completely different environment, and Tyler's really trying to get caught up to that environment. So it's really important that while we have an ideal of what we would like to have happen, that ideal may not actually be realized. And so it's important to be very realistic in our goals system, and also realize that it is overwhelming. And so you kind of just have to start on one thing at a time, really prioritize what are the things that are most important and would have the greatest impact, and really start developing a plan. Now, that plan can start with really a behavior plan. So if there are behaviors that are not conducive to developing relationships, things that are either harmful for themselves or harmful for others, those are the first priorities that you want to get taken care of, because it's going to be very difficult to maintain a relationship unless you have those issues dealt with. And what we don't want to have, of course, is our children being feared. We want them to be accepted. We want them to have healthy relationships with others as well. And so asking those questions, what behaviors prevent my child from connecting with another person? What are those behaviors? And when you can concentrate on those behaviors, then and really start working on unexpected and expected, when you can do that, then at that point, it becomes a workable relationship issue. So you work on those social behaviors, you do the expected, unexpected, good choices, bad choices, other concepts like, stop, and just think, and then look and listen, so they can start to understand the context. And those are concepts that we teach in other programming, but just those basic concepts. Once we have those basic concepts down, then that allows us to apply those concepts in developing relationships with other people.